Hello again. This week, Pastor Andy continued in Romans with chapter 1, verses 8 through 15. So today, as part of our history lesson, I want to touch on verses 14 through 16. Verse 14 says, I am under obligation to both Greek and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. So I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. As I've been studying this history and getting more into the letters of Paul, I agree with some teachers and historians and professors who study the scriptures. And I'm beginning to think myself, as they do, that the greatest Christian who ever lived was most likely Paul. Historically, let's look back at his life. He intently persecuted Christians. He intently persecuted the church of Jesus Christ, hauling Christians to prison and watching while some of them were literally put to a horrific death. It is implied as we study that he took his job very serious. He was quite pleased with the outcome of his job. He was obligated to his job, and he did his job very well. As we move ahead in time, Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus, a very dramatic event. When you study or you read the story of Paul's conversion and how his life was changed, it's awe-inspiring. It is just a tremendous story. We all have a testimony about our conversion or how our lives changed, but the change of Paul trumps probably everybody. It was at this point, Paul, who at this time was called Saul, saw Jesus, literally saw Jesus. It is believed that at this point, Paul asked Jesus two of the greatest questions anyone has ever asked. The first question is, who are you, Lord? And the second question is, what would you have me do? I wonder if any of us have ever asked that question. It was from that very moment that Paul spent the rest of his life seeking the answers to those two questions. As we look at verse 14, Paul states, I am under obligation. Now, some translations will say, I am a debtor, or I am in debt. Now, Paul was faithful to his obligations to the gospel. But to who or whom was he indebted to? I feel that answer is very easy. He was a debtor to Jesus Christ for the tremendous gift he gave him, changing his life. Looking back at verse 1, which we studied last week, verse 1 tells us Paul introduces himself as Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ. Paul saw himself as a slave to the one who had died for him and who had changed his life. Paul knew that there were others who had suffered and who had bled and who had died so that he might know Jesus. Stephen, for example, had died a martyr's death. He died by stoning for his faith, and Paul watched it. As a debtor to those around him, he said, I am a debtor to both Greek and to the barbarians. I am a debtor does not mean that they had conferred any favor on him or had given him anything which bound him to make this in return. But he was under an obligation to preach the gospel to all who would listen, whomever possible. Paul knew that he owed a debt and an obligation to share the message of Christ to everyone around him. Greeks and barbarians, the scriptures say. Paul includes Rome or the Roman people under the Greeks so that he can make a division based on nations or cultures. Greeks is a tag name. Basically, it denotes those who dwelt not only in Greece, but as the Greeks were the most polished people. The term became synonymous with being polished or refined. The upper crust, as we might say today. As we study history, we see this all over time. The difference between old money and new money. You might have two millionaires, but one was raised with the refineries and the fine cultures and is this, as opposed to the new person who is just thrust into the position. It is a hierarchy. It is a cultural status. Now, barbarians were all the people of other nations and other cultures who were not so refined, if that makes that a little bit simpler. Now, Paul would designate the Romans as Greek and not barbarians because at this time, the Romans claimed to have basically their origin from Greece. Roman history tells the story of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers who, as the story opens in the series of events that led to the founding of the city of Rome. A quick overview of this. In mythology claims that Romulus and Remus were the twin sons of either the god Mercury or the demigod Hercules, and a woman by the name of Rhea Silva. She was the wife of the king, a mortal king. Now, this mortal king felt that this happened due to force or by rape, and he felt that he had been betrayed. So, since he had this disgrace, he placed Rhea Silva in prison and ordered that the twins be killed. Now, instead of killing them, and he did this because he felt that if he was to kill the sons of this god or this demigod, it would bring them anger. So they were placed in a basket and set a sail to float down the river Tiber. This is not the first time that in Scripture that we've heard the story of an infant being saved by being put in a basket and put on the river. Now the twins were found and nursed and suckled by a she-wolf, and later raised by a peasant family, but they grew into great power. And over time, the power that they gained, they begin to argue with each other over who was the best. Not the first time we've seen brothers argue over status. In time, Romulus eventually killed Remus, and then he became the founder of the city of Rome. We can go into a lot of detail on this through the history of Roman history. So taking the long way around the barn, so to speak, the Roman people claimed that they were of Greek descent. Makes sense. Not only was Paul a debtor, but he was also ready for any and all opportunities to share the gospel. He was ready to preach the gospel no matter what it took. Let me stop here and ask you a question. Are any of you, myself included, ready to share the gospel no matter what? No matter what. I heard someone once say that they would die for Jesus. But the bigger question is, will you live for Jesus? Paul was ready to live, and he was ready to die if that's what was needed. Paul knew the dangers that he would face, but he was ready to die if that's what was needed to spread the gospel. Paul said in verse 16, we're going to jump ahead to 16, but he said, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and then also to the Greek. Now, I think there is one person who stands out above all who has ever lived or who ever will live, and that person is Jesus. And his gospel needs to be spread. The purpose of the gospel is to bring people, all people who believe, no matter who they are, where they come from. The purpose of the gospel is to bring them to Jesus for salvation. Now I leave you with this. Paul lived his life to bring others to Christ. He knew his obligation, and he was ready. And he was not ashamed. Jesus transformed Paul's life to such an extent that he wanted to tell the world, the whole world, not just one group. Everyone. I'll see you next week.